Chapter 14. Bo insisted that Tag leave the ranch house the next day. They donned helmets and signed out one of the side-by-side ATVs the Arrow seat owned. Bo grabbed a map of the trails they could drive in the area, but Tag knew them all by heart anyway. He'd grown up with Roxy riding around this ranch. He let Bo drive. Tag's brain was hung up on the new song he'd written and the ideas for the future he'd purposely conjured to bring that song to life. He'd meant to win her back with Roxy's song, but when he'd started this new one, he'd realized this was the one that would speak to Roxy's heart. Hearing her say she liked it solidified his desperation to make that future come true. What surprised him was that every time he brought those daydreams to mind, he didn't picture Roxy on his Tennessee farm outside of Nashville. He pictured them here. He hadn't seen the inside of Roxy's house, so those parts blurred, but he could see him throwing a football around in her front yard and riding horses with the little girl in the saddle in front of him, since Roxy didn't like riding. Sitting out on the swing he'd seen on her front porch and serenading her on summer nights. When Bo pulled to the top of a lookout and cut the engine, both men removed their helmets and got out to admire the view. Most people only saw the beauty of these mountains from the highway that ran over the top. Tag had gotten the privilege of hiking, riding, and driving the many mountain roads that led to gorgeous vistas, like the one he stared out over now, a green valley carpeted by pine trees as far as he could see. He'd left it all, because as beautiful as it was, he'd always recognized that his dreams meant more. He had never understood why Roxy couldn't leave it for him. "Am I too young to retire?" he asked Bo. Bo's head snapped in his direction, but one thing that Tag liked about his manager was the fact that he took time to consider the things he said in situations like this. After about 30 seconds, he asked, "Would she be worth it?" "Without a doubt." Tag stared across the valley. "Everything I've done up to this point, the awards I've won, none of it is enough without her. Nothing will be enough. I could go on to be the next George Strait, and my life wouldn't be complete." All this time he'd thought Roxy was running away from him, but maybe all this time he'd been running away from her. Maybe his dreams weren't as important as he thought, like Roxy had tried to tell him all along. Silence settled between them for a long time before Bo sighed. "You really could be the next George Strait," he said in a low voice. Tag chuckled. "I did all the things I set out to do. That's no small accomplishment." Bo reached over from where they both leaned against the front of the ATV and clapped Tag on the shoulder. "That's the truth." They left the discussion at that as they headed back for the ranch house. Having said it out loud made the offer, even if not to Roxy yet, made him consider how he'd always approached winning her over. He'd expected her to eventually see his side. His dreams, his accomplishments were a big deal. Roxy's wishes to stay home in this small-town life seemed unreasonable in the face of all he'd done, pure stubbornness. But she loved the idea of home and family settled here as much as he loved his career, and he'd dismissed that for too long. He'd done a lot in the last 8 years, and it felt like ripping out a part of him to walk away, but Roxy could make up for more than what he'd leave behind. When the sounds of a guitar wafted in through her open living room window, Roxy immediately went to close out whatever impromptu concert Tag was giving over at the ranch house. The night before had worn down her resistance to him, and any more of his new songs about life with her might push her over the edge, make getting over him this time as bad as it had been back in college. But as she stood next to the window, she realized the music came from closer than she'd first guessed, specifically from her front porch. She went to her front door and pulled it open. Tag grinned at her from where he sat on her porch swing. Oh, heaven help her. He looked like the boy she'd first fallen in love with. Dirty jeans and boots, his hair matted against one side with sweat and dirt, and a t-shirt hanging just right over his broad shoulders. The slick cowboy that girls across the country sighed over could make Roxy's heart pitter-patter along with the rest of them. But this man, she had to grip the doorframe just to keep from fainting. She recognized the song that Bellamy had told her about, the one he'd played last night to force her to picture their future. It took her a second, but she realized he'd changed the words to this song too. "I'm going to sit with Roxy on this front porch swing, watch our babies play in the yard, live that life that she's always dreamed, count my success just in being by her side." She held up a hand as she stepped out, begging him to stop. "You said you didn't lie with your music, Tag, but you know we can't have the things you're talking about." Tag set his guitar aside and stood up. "We can if I choose you." She stilled, shock dousing her at what he'd just offered, what she'd wanted him to offer all those years ago, but had known it was unfair to ask. "You can't choose me," she whispered. "I can. I'd choose you every day over this, Rox. Don't you know that? In any lifetime, any world, I'd choose you." Curse him, he could wax poetic, even without that blasted guitar in his hands. "You're talking nonsense," she insisted. She put a hand over her eyes, the weight of it all crashing over her. Tag leaving country music for her, walking away at the top of his game. She had never considered him actually doing this. Maybe she'd even hid behind that every time she pushed him away. What would it cost him to give her what she needed? "You're talking crazy," she muttered, panic inside her building. He could lose a part of him, and that would be her fault. "Roxy." His voice was gentle and soothing, and she loved and hated how he understood her fears without even knowing them. "Why'd you come back?" she cried. "We both could have been happy apart, but you dragged us through this when what we want will never be the same." He took a long stride to close the distance between them, his hands coming to her hips to pull her closer. "Were you happy without me, Rox?" he asked in a low, husky voice. He moved in, trapping her between him and the door, a situation that both terrified her and made an ache for him sear her. The fire roared through her as he bent over her, pressing his lips to hers. It was all far better than she remembered, maybe because 8 years of memories over their last kiss hadn't done this justice. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him to her tighter, tighter even than he held her, as though she could make up for lost time in this one embrace. She gripped his shoulders. That and his arms felt like the only thing keeping her standing. His hands ran up her back, leaving another streak of fire there. Those lips, the sweet lips that sang only to her, pressed a different song into her now, one that reminded her of slow, heady tunes and crashing beats all at the same time. "You can't just walk away." He pulled back for a ragged breath, staring at her with desperation and whispering her name in a way that made her stomach tumble and throw herself back to him. He lifted her to her tiptoes as he kissed her again, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, need for him shooting through her like lightning bolts. She pictured kissing him like this all the time, there on the porch, sweet kisses together on the swing. She wanted to do that forever. But they couldn't. Not really. Forget that this kiss put to shame any kiss she'd ever shared with anyone. It was crazy to think they could have it all, that he wouldn't turn bitter in a year or two or beg to go back. And how could she tell him no after all he'd just offered? She shoved away. "No, you can't do this." Then she shoved him harder because no, she hadn't been happy without him, but she'd been fine. Now she wouldn't ever be again, and nothing had really changed. But the shoving only moved him an inch away, his face stiff with confusion and hurt. So she lashed out with words. "You can't come here after all this time and make some big announcement that you still love me and expect things to just work out, Tag," she cried. He expected too much. He took too much. She needed too much. He shook his head, frustration evident in the slant of his brows and the stiff way he stepped back. "I never stopped telling you I loved you, Roxy," he said. "I've been singing it for 8 years. I sent you tickets to every concert I ever played, hoping you'd show up. I didn't just walk away like you did." "You stopped sending tickets years ago." Emotion blocked her chest as she remembered getting those envelopes in the first months after he left her in Laramie, of thinking she'd finally gotten through the worst of missing him, only to see the notes begging her to come. His scowl deepened, the fire between them turning his dark eyes with anger. "Every concert, Roxy, every single one, and you never showed up, not once." She clenched her fists against this new accusation. He'd probably trusted it to some assistant living his big life. "You're saying you'll stay in this moment because you can't be sensible about our future. You'll choose me now, even if all it does is make us both miserable in the end. That's the path that would always have led to." That's the path this had always led to, both of them forcing fate and not understanding the consequences. She'd been smart to try and take the path the first time he'd tried sweeping her off her feet. If only he'd listened. He took another step away and then another, glaring at her as he retreated across the porch. "I'd forgotten how hard it was to make you happy," he snapped, the words whipping across her as though he'd used his hand. "You hate me because I left. You hate me when I begged to stay. You're just looking for a reason not to love me." He stalked off the porch, grabbing his guitar on the way. When he got to the bottom, he whirled on her. "All I've ever done is pour my heart out to you with every word, with every song. You never understood any of it, and I never got it until now that you've never tried, that you don't even want to." He marched the rest of the way out of the yard without looking back, hopping into the side-by-side ATV parked in her driveway and then speeding away, pebbles flying in his wake. Roxy could shut out his songs until her dying day, never listen to another one, but she couldn't unhear the one he'd sung on her porch only a few moments ago, or unhear the song he'd brought back to life inside her with his kiss, or shut off the haunting melody his pain and his anger played inside her. When he'd walked out the door in Laramie, the weight of losing him had taken away her breath. She'd felt deep inside that it had changed something for them that she could never fix. It had felt like a last goodbye. But this one, it felt as though he'd snatched away her entire life. By the next morning, Tag and his entourage had left Little River. Roxy watched 2 SUVs, black like the ones that had brought him a month before, roll down the country road to the highway, dust kicking up behind them. When he'd first shown up, she had expected his finally leaving to bring with it a sense of release. Another encounter with Tag survived, but the sight of those SUVs turning onto the highway and disappearing from sight only left her with emptiness.